Think forward. Think Research Channel.
Well, hello. I'm Dave McIntyre, Director of the Integrative Center for Homeland Security at Texas A&M. I want to welcome you to Bring It Home, where we take concepts of Homeland Security and national security and bring them home to you. On previous issues of Bring It Home, we've talked about issues surrounding the waging of war, and today we're going to get right to that subject. The issue of waging conventional war. The reason we're going to do this is because war is a critical life or death issue for a nation. Nations should never enter this for trivial reasons. Literally, all the resources of the nation can eventually be at risk. All the elements of national power really need to be involved when the nation wages war. Economic power, political power, informational power, and military power, of course. But you can't do that. You should not wage war sort of with one hand or one finger while you're focused on something else, because the war will spin out of control and consume you. Many nations have learned that. In fact, war is the link between national security and homeland security. Let's talk about a couple of things we've had from previous presentations in this series. Let's step back just a second to see what Clausewitz said about war. He said that it is not just a matter of violence. It's not just force. It's not just a duel. He said it's not just a matter of logic. It's not just cold, clear reasoning. And it's not just passion. All three of these things are involved. In fact, it's a synthesis of these things, and it's constantly changing. So you may enter war for what you think are cold and dispassionate reasons and find out that your people are carried away by passion. You may find that chance intervenes. You must keep these things in the background as you consider entering a war. Secondly, we've got to consider at the very beginning that wars have rules. Now, let me tell you very quickly that most people do not sit down, consider entering war and say, well, first, let me figure out what the rules are. This is not football or soccer. However, intellectually, they're playing within a certain box. What are we allowed to do? What is the justice of the war before it begins? How do we wage war justly? We don't poison medical supplies. And then how do we conduct ourselves after the war is over? And we do this so that we can minimize the times that we go to war, narrow the reasons, and wage a quicker war and have a more just and better peace at the end. That is, after all, should, after all, be the purpose of war. Lastly, we've learned that there are three traditional terms. One of these is that wars should be limited. Some wars are limited. That is, you have a specific piece of land that you're after. You have some particular injustice you want to right. Or wars may be general. That is, looking for the overthrow of the enemy. But the term total war, which many people use, actually is an improper term. That would mean using literally every resource at your asset, which is in fact illegal, and always comes back to bite those nations that try it. For one reason, if you use literally any resource and the other nation you're warring against knows they cannot trust you because you'll use any asset at your disposal, they can't even surrender. So that's the reason we don't wage total war. Here's the important point for today's lecture, and that is that in order to wage war properly, you really have to understand the context of war. And these are sort of the things that go into every war, and every war is different. You've got to think about the geography of the war. Waging war in the desert is vastly different from waging war in the jungle. Waging the war in Europe between Germany and France over relatively short distances turned out to be vastly different for the Germans than waging war in Russia over huge, enormous distances. So geography really matters. History really matters. And the history of the enemy that you're up against. The Japanese made a terrible mistake thinking that the Russian history, Russian evaluation, and their experience with the Russians after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 would be the same sort. They could expect the same sort of thing from the Americans, who had a quite different history when the Japanese went to war with them some 40 years later. Culture, of course, matters enormously. And this is a mistake that people frequently make. Let's just take take the American Army waging war on first the Indians in the eastern part of the United States and then the Indians in the western part of the United States. They had an entirely different culture. One of them was based on villages, the other based on nomadic principles, on nomadic tribes. Economics will be different. That will influence the war. International influence, where some nations have more influence internationally, are able to bring power to bear, as the Algerians did against the French. The leadership matters. Think if Robert E. Lee had been on the side of the Union at the outbreak of the Civil War. Organization and bureaucracy, the reputation of the German General Staff, for example, for efficiency. The technology matters. The technology that could not defend against Napoleon's assaults was completely changed to rifles and rifled cannon. And that technology was able to resist Napoleon's assaults a few years later when they were made by Lee, and then on the battlefield of the First World War. Technology changed warfare, as did the tank, for example, and the radio. The resources really matter. Japan really did not understand. It's clear now that their leaders did not understand the resources available to the American military if they ever decided to wage general war and not just limited war. And then finally, other players and allies. You may think that you're going to war with one country and find you're going to war with an entire group of countries. This, of course, happened during Athens and Sparta as allies began to kick in. The point here I'm trying to make is that as you begin to wage war, you have to select a political strategy, an economic strategy, and military strategy, and they all must be done within a context. We've said that strategy is the theory of cause and effect to achieve victory against a thinking enemy over time. And we've looked in previous presentations at the idea that victory is getting what you're settled for at a price you're willing to pay. It's not getting everything. And then lastly, take that idea of political strategy, economic strategy, and military strategy, and don't forget that you've got to consider your domestic audience, your people at home. You're not just making war on someone overseas, you're making war with someone at home. We're going to take these concepts and carry them on at our next presentation of Bring It Home. Well, welcome back to Bring It Home, where we take concepts of Homeland Security and national security and bring them home to you. Delighted today to be joined by Dr. Chuck Herman, who has a long history of working in the area of international affairs. Chuck really started out his career early on as a young appointee on the National Security Council, working for Henry Kissinger. Has worked through a variety of positions of increasing responsibility, and today holds the Scowcroft Chair at the George Bush School. Also directs the International Affairs International Relations Program here at Texas A&M as part of the George Bush School. So Chuck, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Going to start talking about something that some students immediately recoil from, but you and I know makes the difference between whether or not we're able to avoid global war. And that's the concept of international affairs theory.
Yep. Students' eyes roll to the top of their head on that one.
But it's born, the whole concept of international relations theory is born out of the First World War. And the concept is, how do we prevent this from happening again?
That's right. Woodrow Wilson, who was a political scientist after all, before he became President of the United States, was very concerned with how can we create institutions that will prevent this from happening. He had a theory about how to avoid war.
So we've got 20 million dead, and in 1919, the first chair of international affairs or international relations is established in Edinburgh, Scotland. Right. And since then, a variety of theories have developed, and today they're pretty standard. And students really who want to have a policy position need to begin with a grounding in these theories, don't they?
They do. They do. That's critically important.
So what kinds of theories are we working with? After the Second World War, the Vietnam, the Cold War, what are the major theories today that a student would learn?
Well, there are two really very global theories. The first one, idealism or liberalism that grew out of Woodrow Wilson's work, and then the response to World War II, really the crystallization of something called realism. Both those have evolved, so there is neoliberalism and neorealism.
Changes over time.
Right, exactly.
Now, when we say liberalism, it's important to make a point that we're not talking about left and right, conservative and liberal at all. This is
right.
The term's used in a different way. How about explain to us that cause and effect relationship that we today call the theory of liberalism?
Right. Well, the idea is that liberalism is grounded in the idea about the human behavior, that we can, in fact, learn to live in larger and larger social groups.
We can improve our behavior.
And improve our behavior. We lived, presumably, according to history books, as cavemen. We lived in city-states. We lived in nations. Hey,
Tribes.
guess what? And they developed norms and institutions for controlling and regulating human behavior.
So this theory would suggest that better institutions, the UN was an example. We have other institutions, the Kyoto Climate Treaty, for example, or international law.
And they would argue the family is an institution. Religion is an institution. And so it's different to distinguish between organizations and institutions, which are the norms and rules that prescribe human behavior.
So the idea is for someone who's a student, later to be a policymaker, perhaps a leader in the government, they better understand that these things really influence human behavior when you make the policy.
Right. So, but actually, a policy really is a hypothesis. Every policymaker wants to try to affect something. So they're saying, if we do X, then it's more likely they will do Y or won't do Y. If we refuse to negotiate with North Korea, then eventually they are likely to come around and say, hey, we've got to talk to you.
Or the other way
Or
around.
the other way,
around.
exactly.
Because the theories may cut both directions.
Exactly.
Can you give us another example of classic liberalism as it was conceived after the Second World War, classic idealism that says if we will hold certain concepts or ideas, we can improve the human condition?
The issue is, how do we explain cooperation? You know, there are some circumstances where if we can agree, we don't care what the decision is, but we have to all agree to the same rule. Driving down the street, let's all drive on the right side or the left side. It doesn't matter which, but boy, it's really important that we do that. So we develop norms or rules. What about international trade? How do we make it possible for nations or organizations to swap goods, to exchange, to have contracts? These are ideas that create institutions.
So
Peace becomes really important.
These concepts have very real, these theories have very real outcomes. ASEAN would be an example where we began the construct of nations out in Southeast Asia by just encouraging them to talk. And what they concluded was much less important than the fact that they were talking. We gave them a structure. And now we've had major progress.
But of course, realism comes on the other side and says,
let's hear what they have to say.
You know what? We live in an anarchical world. And every nation has to defend itself. And sooner or later, power matters and self-interest. And so realism and idealism are really clashing in some important kinds of ways in trying to explain what's going on in the world.
Realism would say common sense dictates, a view of history dictates that you got to learn to protect yourself and you need to provide for your own defense even if you don't intend to be an aggressor.
Right.
On the other hand, liberalism would say you're sending a message.
Right, exactly. And there's a concept here which is really important to us, and that is the notion of the security dilemma. And that is, when you increase your defense, the other guy perceives that you may be aggressive. And so they increase their military capability. And then you see they've increased their military capability, so you need to do more yourself. And so you get in these arms spirals.
So, for example, a ballistic missile defense, really the arguments around that are built on a theory. One theory says, I need to defend myself. I'm crazy to leave myself open to nuclear attack. The other theory says, by building that defense, you're sending a message to them that you'll be impervious and can attack at will.
Our theories are getting better as we learn, but it also, the problem has changed. Darn, the world doesn't remain static. So, for example, there's a really well-developed theory of deterrence that was very important in the Cold War. But now we live in a different kind of world where non-state actors become terrorists. How do we deter them? So the situation changes, demanding new theory.
Chuck, we've got just a minute or so left. Talk just a second about the idea of power preponderance, the idea that some rising powers, maybe you should satisfy them instead of competing with them.
That's right. The notion that there may be status quo states that can accept merging new powers and avoid conflict with them. On the other hand, there is also a theory that the top dog power and the rising power must inevitably clash.
Well, so one of those is going to say, for example, let's find structures to reach out to China.
Exactly.
Ways that we can cooperate.
Exactly.
Even, for example, academic exchanges would be a way for us to avoid conflict. And the other one is saying, this is a rising power, you better get ready. If we're not ready to fight, that means we'll have to fight.
The new President of the United States and his staff are going to be working from a foundation of theories in the policies they pursue.
It'll be interesting to see, Chuck, what comes out of this. Any final thoughts for a student who might be considering international affairs and international relations as a career?
Don't let your eyes glaze over when somebody says it's important to understand theory, because that's what drives public policy.
Very critical if you're going to look at public policy and international affairs.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for joining us here on Bring It Home, a show where we try to take issues of Homeland Security and national security and bring them home to you. Hope you'll stay with us because there's more to follow. Well, hello and welcome to Bring It Home, where we take issues of Homeland Security and national security and bring them home to you. And with us today is Alyssa Stevens, who's the Operations Officer for the Integrative Center for Homeland Security. Alyssa, thanks for being with us. Tell me just one thing that you found especially interesting.
Well, this week I read the FEMA's disaster declaration process. This was a report published by the Congressional Research Service.
For anybody who's been asleep for the last 10 years, what is FEMA?
FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
And they're responsible for?
They're responsible for assessing and providing disaster relief.
And so this disaster declaration process is how they actually kick into service. Now, this is not things that happen before disasters. They do some mitigation and planning and so forth. But once a disaster kicks in, tell us what happens. How do we get to use FEMA funding and resources?
Okay. Well, under the Robert Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, there are two forms of presidential action. There's either an emergency declaration or a major disaster declaration. An emergency declaration is when a threat is recognized, such as with Hurricane Katrina. Before it actually hit, we realized this was going to be a huge disaster, and so they planned and appropriated funds to take care of this. In the case of a major disaster declaration, this is as a result of a disaster, and the federal aid is much broader.
So, for example, like a tornado or after something strikes.
Correct.
Now, the idea here is one that many people don't recognize. FEMA isn't really there to make everyone whole. It's not like a big insurance agency, is it?
No, it's definitely not. FEMA is actually a relatively small organization of about 3,000 members, many of which are part-time.
Yeah, they bring part-time on after the storm and they do the analysis, but the federal funding that kicks in isn't necessarily to pay for everything.
No, that's correct. FEMA does not have such funds to do so. A lot of times, state and local is supposed to take care of what they can, and FEMA comes in to help with the rest.
If there's insurance, people are to use their insurance first. And
That's
so there's
correct.
a misconception, I think, about what FEMA is allowed, what they're not allowed to do.
Right. FEMA is definitely not insurance.
Well, in order to get a better handle on what they are allowed to do and what that process is so people understand better, I think this is a great report, FEMA's disaster declaration process. Where would people find this? How would they learn more about it?
People can learn about this report at crs.gov. They can
That's
also,
Congressional Research Service,
Yes.
crs.gov.
They can also visit our website for more on this publication.
Okay, and we have a number of other things on our site. This is, we call it TEX. We've got about 6,000 documents, and explain very quickly what it does.
TEX essentially has basically everything from critical infrastructure documents, government, emergency preparedness, health, public safety.
And you can get a one-page summary of each one of those documents.
Yes.
Well, I hope people will use that, and hope people will come back and join us for more here on Bring It Home, where we take issues of national security and homeland security and bring them home to you. welcome back to Bring It Home, where we take concepts of Homeland Security and national security and bring it home to you. Talking on this episode with Dr. Todd Kent, who is the Director of Liberal Arts at Texas A&M Qatar. Todd, thanks for being with us.
It's great to be here.
Okay, for those of us who were born and raised in Texas, where is Qatar?
Well, it's a peninsula right on the side of Saudi Arabia. So if you went directly across from Qatar, you would run right into Iran. If you go up the Gulf, you'd run into Kuwait and eventually Iraq. So it's right there in the heart of the Arabian Gulf, as they say.
Texas A&M Qatar, what exactly is that?
Texas A&M Qatar is a branch campus of the main campus here in College Station. So when a student gets a degree from there, their diploma reads exactly like it would here. So it's really a branch campus.
So this is a part of the Texas A&M system, just like College Station or Texas A&M Texarkana or Texas A&M Corpus Christi?
Yeah, it is. It's the best way. It's not a separate campus. It's a branch of the main campus. Is the best way to describe it.
About how many students do you have?
Right now we have about 280 students. We're on our way to 500. That'll be we think a steady state, and that's eventually where we'd like to be.
And where are they from?
Students really from all over the region. About 40 to 50% of our students currently are Qataris, born and raised there in the state of Qatar. The rest are from the broader region: Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan. So it's a very diverse group. I think we have over 30 nations represented in our student body.
Now, different parts of branch campuses at Texas A&M do have different specialties. Do you have a specialty in Qatar?
We offer engineering degrees in four different disciplines, and that's really the focus. When the Qatar Foundation of the state of Qatar invited Texas A&M over, they wanted us to focus on engineering, and so we offer an engineering degree. And the reason I'm there is that a student at Texas A&M, we believe that they need to be broadly educated. Therefore, part of their training is in the liberal arts and also the sciences. So a student has to take history, chemistry, physics, just like any other student would, in addition to their engineering core curriculum.
Todd, I taught English at West Point when it was an engineering school. Sometimes a challenge, because that's not always the first reason that our students came to West Point. Talk a little bit about teaching students at Qatar. How is it alike and different? You taught here at Texas A&M. How is it alike and different?
Well, in some ways it's identical. You're dealing with 18 to 22-year-old young people who have those challenges, time management issues and others. So they're very similar to students as you would know them. The challenge they face is most of them English is a second language. So they're taking political science and English and history and any other course in a language that's it's not their native language. So there are struggles. They're learning to write. And just like students here, we have a writing center at the main campus. We have a writing center on campus. We have a lot of ways to try to encourage the students to improve their not only their verbal skills, but their ability to write and communicate, because that's a struggle.
It's always a tough challenge, adapting to college. But being from that region, I suspect has some special peculiarities. Did you follow your personal specialty is in the state and local politics and government. Did your students follow the American elections closely, or not so much?
They were fascinated with the elections. I think they had this idea that we're going to have an election and the power is going to change, and we're going to hand over the keys to the government. And that's fascinating to most of them, because many of them come from countries where that doesn't happen. So they were interested in the elections. They didn't fully understand them. They understand that we had a John McCain versus a Barack Obama, but the details of the election they thought were interesting. That the fact that we have really in this country, it's 50 separate elections taking place in the states, and then we add up the score, if you would think. So that was interesting. And every time we would have an election forum, we'd have a packed house, just because they find it interesting. They love the idea, the concept of political ads. That one candidate could say something about another candidate, either mean or whatever, and that was okay. They love political ads.
So I guess they don't get a lot of telephone calls at dinner time in Qatar.
No, polling is not. It's on the forefront, though. In fact, we're working on some research projects involving survey research, because the whole region has been understudied. And so that's the next step. So maybe in the future we'll see political polls.
Todd, how did there come to be a Texas A&M Qatar branch?
Well, in about 1995, the leaders of the state of Qatar decided that we need to modernize, we need to be more progressive, we need our country needs to move forward. And they realized that they needed to expand their human capital. And the only way they could do that was through education. So they decided they wanted American-based higher education in Qatar. And so they went and they began to talk to universities over here. In fact, Cornell was Virginia Commonwealth came over early, offered a kind of a certificate program, but then they brought in Cornell, which offers a medical program, Carnegie Mellon, a business and computer science, Northwestern, a communication and journalism, Georgetown offers a School of Foreign Affairs, and Texas A&M offers engineering degrees.
So there are a lot of schools there like the Texas A&M Qatar branch.
We have an area we call Education City, and all these schools are located within those borders. And so it's like a campus. It's just that each department or each college is run by a different U.S. university. So it's very exciting, and there's a lot of great opportunities for students.
Now, as a state school, Texas A&M different branches have a number of common requirements. How do you address those requirements?
Well, in the state of Texas, by law, all students take state and local politics, they take American government, they take 2 history classes, and so we offer those same classes. So in fact, our students will take state and local politics.
And they Texas history?
They take Texas history, and you know, it's interesting. At first they have a hard time understanding why it's important, but as we get into it, they actually kind of enjoy it, because the idea of federalism, that you have local government that has responsibility for something, in most of these countries, other than India, is a concept that they have never heard of. Most everything is directed from the national government, and so they're very interested in the fact that you could actually have local leaders that have power.
Todd, you personally have had some very interesting experiences. You've been several times on the news media, Al Jazeera, haven't you?
Yes, Al Jazeera English is a branch of the Al Jazeera network, which you have Al Jazeera Arabic and Al Jazeera English. It goes into about 100 million homes, and they realized their viewers were interested in the U.S. elections but didn't understand it. So last spring I got the opportunity to just about 3 times a week since last spring to go on and give political analysis of the U.S. election to Asia and Africa largely. And it was very interesting because the newsroom, they were very interested, and what was very interesting about it is they didn't care about domestic issues. All they cared about was foreign policy issues, and I kept trying to explain to them, Americans vote on domestic issues and foreign policy issues. In this election, you can't understand it by looking at foreign policy. So, but it was very interesting, and you realize a survey was done by the University of Maryland in 8 countries in the Middle East. 53% get their entire news from Al Jazeera. And we as a U.S. government have struggled being able to at least get our policy opinions known on that network. And so we've struggled. We've lost a lot.
Todd, I got about 30 seconds left. Where do you see the program going?
I think the program continues to grow and mature. We're getting to a place where I think that Texas A&M is really the leading educator of engineers in the Middle East, and that's a great position for Texas A&M to be in.
And some of those students will end up over here in our graduate program.
We hope so, and we hope to offer some graduate programs in the future, but I'm sure a lot of them will study here at Texas A&M.
A final thought for any professors who might think about joining you over there?
It's a great challenge. It's a wonderful adventure, and it makes your world bigger. I think that's the way to describe it.
Here on Bring It Home, we take concepts of national security, homeland security, and try to bring them home to you. I'm glad today we were able to be joined by Dr. Todd Kent, who's the Director of Liberal Arts for Texas A&M Qatar. Welcome to Bring It Home. I'm Dave McIntyre, Director of the Integrative Center for Homeland Security. And here on Bring It Home, we try to take concepts of homeland security and national security and bring them home to you. We've been talking about waging conventional war, and this is the second in a series of short lectures talking about that subject. Last time we made the point that war is complex and vital. It is life and death for a nation. It shouldn't be waged for trivial causes. And this is the link between what's happening overseas, national security, and homeland security. We also addressed briefly the idea of selecting a national strategy. Think about a political strategy, then a military strategy, economic and then military strategy. Remembering what is a strategy, a theories of cause and effect that will achieve victory against a thinking enemy over time. Never forgetting this definition of victory, not getting everything you want, but getting what you're willing to settle for at a price you're willing to pay, and always remembering that your strategies must consider domestic forces, those people at home. Now this is an interesting point, I think, on where can you target your strategies? What are you targeting against? And interestingly enough, there are really only 6 target categories. Clausewitz said that wars are a balance of, between passion and chance and reason. And a better way to think about that is a passion between the people and the capabilities that the people bring to war, and that would be all the logistics capabilities, manufacturing capabilities, and so forth. Forces, that's the military, and the leadership, both political and military. And each of those can be attacked in 2 ways. You can attack their actual capability, go after the manufacturing base, for example. Go after the forces and destroy them in the field. Actually try to bring down, find and track down their leaders. Or you can attack their will, convince them to stop fighting because of losses or because something else is at risk. So really, when you think about waging war, there are really only 6 sorts of target sets out there: the people, the forces, and the leaders. And you can attack either their capability or their will. Now, you want to array against them a national strategy that uses your political power. And these are just some examples. It may be just a matter of collecting power. It may be a matter of working with other people in order to balance power against an enemy who's maybe stronger than you individually. You may want to talk about collective security, where several people sign on to put their fortunes at risk together. NATO is an example of collective security. International regimes like the UN or international law can be a form of political power. So is hegemonic stability, where you try to collect a large number of smaller nations under. All of these are ways that you may collect and use national power. You also want to think about economic power. And here, we're not going to try to give you an entire economic lesson in 60 seconds, but here are just some things to think about. Some people really focus just internally, what they can produce, their own resources, a program of mercantilism. Others try to control trade overseas through colonialism, or by saying we're going to export raw materials or export manufacturers' goods and import raw materials. Liberalism says free trades and market will make us even better. Socialism tries to control trade through Marxism, and so forth. You have to think about your economic strategy. Now, this is the most detailed. This is the issue of military strategy. And boy, there are a lot of choices to deal with here. You can think about attrition, which is sort of nibbling away at the enemy, or annihilation, which is overwhelming force. Attrition, nibbling away, is what happened in the First World War, where the Germans and the French both said we can stand more casualties than they can. Annihilation is where you try to crush them, as for instance with the blitzkrieg. You might try to disrupt the leadership or paralyze it. You might try exhaustion. Frequently that's used against democracies, where they have low levels of casualties, but for a long period of time, and the people at home just get tired of it. Asymmetric versus symmetric attack. Are you going to have your forces directly against their forces, or some way maneuver around them? For example, use an aircraft carrier against a land-based enemy who can't protect himself. Would you attack the sinews of war? For example, their logistics or production facilities, or find just some node of that sinew, like, for example, oil production or the railroads. Air Force theorists have talked about the war of the rings, where you leap over the forces in the field and get at the leadership. Or precision war, where you say, I know precisely the targets I want to go after that will bring down the enemy, and I want to attack them precisely. Sequential or cumulative war. You know, the Navy in World War II was trying to fight sequential war. One major battle, another major battle, another major battle. But actually the submarine force was fighting cumulative war. Sink a ship every day, and you eventually bring the enemy to bay. The point is, you can understand that there are a variety of military strategies which you can learn and then apply. You got to carefully consider them in the whole context that we discovered in the last edition of Waging Conventional War. Lastly, we should mention that then it's time to do the military business. And this is what the military does for a living. Balance those forces. More Air Force or more Army. More tanks or more infantry. Balance the force with logistics. Do we want a big pile of stuff we can't use, or do we need to worry about running out because we haven't created enough? How do we raise, train, and equip the forces? How many divisions do we need? What doctrine will we develop? How will we maneuver on the battlefield? What tactics, techniques, and procedures? And then finally, how do we develop leadership and command? After we've taken all this into account, the first lesson where we talked about the context and the nature and the purpose of war, and this lesson where we've talked about specific techniques of war, then we ask this question: what if the enemy has an entirely different logic or different rules? And that is where we go to the concept of terrorism, because that's exactly what takes place. If you have a force or a military or a country that's used to waging conventional war, which is what we've been talking about here, and they understand the rules and they understand the mechanism, they're likely to find themselves at a great disadvantage in waging war against someone who doesn't use those rules or those techniques or those tactics at all. And once again, that's where national security and homeland security come together. You'll learn more if you stay with us on Bring It Home. Well, we're glad to have you with us on Bring It Home, where we try to take issues of homeland security and safety, public safety, and bring them home to you so you understand them and really feel them and can have an opinion about these issues. Today, I'm glad to say we have a special guest with us. We're talking to Mike Absher, who spent a long and very profitable career serving the United States government. We're going to ask you to tell us about that briefly, Mike. And then served as part of a very important commission with a document just published in June of 2008 called Confidential and Privileged: The President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, Learning Lessons from the Past to Shape the Future. Mike, thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, Mike, how about lay this down for us? What did you do in your career as of public service?
I was a CIA officer in the clandestine service for 32 years. I was served as a chief of station twice overseas, chief of base twice overseas. And my career was all over the world, so I did not have any specialty in terms of location or languages. I had to try to learn several.
I've got to start with this question because we have a lot of students who watch. How did you get in the CIA? How were you attracted? How did you actually make the transition into the CIA?
I got in the CIA because 1961, I thought we were going to go to war with the Soviet Union. It was a bad year in the Cold War. I was working as an assistant city manager in San Antonio, and I said, I can't stay here if we're going to have a war with the Soviet Union. I went to Washington, had several interviews, and finally I had an interview where a guy said, well, why do you want to join CIA? And I said, well, I really don't know. And he said, why is that? I said, because you haven't told me what you do. And he said, that's a good answer, and I'm not going to tell you now. In those days, very little was known about the Central Intelligence Agency. But that kind of interested me. It was intriguing. So I followed through, and I was hired in December of 1961.
Now, you said you were chief of station twice,
Yes.
And the other duty was?
I was chief of base overseas also twice.
Okay, tell us what those duties are. What is a chief of base? And then I'll get you to tell us about the chief of operations.
Well, a chief of base and chief of station are basically the same. Chief of base is usually subordinate to the chief of station in a country. And what they do is they run operations in a country primarily to conduct espionage and counter-espionage and occasionally covert action. They're part of the country team.
That reports to the ambassador.
They report to the ambassador, yes indeed, and to Washington, D.C., to the Director of Central Intelligence, now the Director of National Intelligence.
And the chief of station's different from that in that, what, he has different organizational responsibilities?
The chief of station has responsibilities to the Director of National Intelligence and also the Director of CIA today. But the responsibilities are the same: conduct espionage, counter-espionage, and covert action overseas.
Let me be real clear. Every country does this, don't they?
Correct.
And so every embassy is both a platform for coordination and cooperation with another country, but also a platform for espionage. Those people who are at embassies here in the United States, that's part of their duty, isn't it?
I think that's a very safe statement to say, Dave.
And I'm sure you're a very safe guy. Well, one last point as a chief of station. You've talked about conducting operations overseas, conducting espionage. Generally, though, Americans don't do that themselves, do they? I mean, you use and recruit other people, locals, frequently, don't you?
That is correct. The cornerstone of our espionage is to spot, develop, recruit, and run in place an agent using a foreign language overseas to penetrate another government or an organization or a group of people, such as a terrorist organization about which we need to find out information. So it's clandestine, it's risky, and it's often time-consuming, but can be very profitable.
Mike, here's why that's so important to me on a program that focuses on Homeland Security. Because if it's safe to say that many embassies, perhaps not all of our friends, but many embassies are also running operations here within the United States. It's what embassies do. Then it's also true that many of those embassies are looking to recruit and use Americans here in the same way that we do overseas. And that's something I think Americans ought to be aware of and alert to.
That is correct. As a matter of fact, you'll see also in this study, 1985 was known as the year of the spy, and there were 6 espionage agents arrested in the United States. I'm sorry, there were 9. 6 were accused and convicted of spying for the Soviet Union, 1 for China, 1 for Israel, and 1 for Ghana overseas in Africa. So there were 9 Americans that were committing espionage against our country, and they were all caught and arrested in the same year.
Now tell us about the study. What was the origin of this study, looking back at lessons learned about intelligence in the past and lessons for the future? What was the origin of this study?
The origin came from Ambassador David Abshire, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, and a member of this organization in the Reagan administration. He came to Dr. Roman Popadouk in early 2006, and he's the head of the Lounsbury Foundation in Washington. And he talked to Dr. Popadouk and said, would you all be interested in doing a study of this organization? And Roman said, absolutely. And he came to Mike Desch, Dr. Mike Desch, and to myself, and the 3 of us readily agreed to do this study.
Now tell me briefly, how did you do this? How did you take a look at U.S. intelligence?
We did it kind of in 3 ways, Dave. First of all, we talked to people who had been involved in this, and many people were willing to talk to us about it, but they were not willing to talk to us about the classified recommendations. We made it very clear this is an unclassified study from the very beginning. We also sent some excellent students, graduate students of the Bush School, to the presidential libraries and to a number of libraries around the country to look for unclassified information. We found a surprising amount of information in these libraries. And then we also read memoirs of people. Bob Gates, former president of A&M and now the Secretary of Defense, wrote a terrific memoir called From the Shadows, in which he talked a lot about this study and also other things. So we had a 3-pronged approach here.
That study is confidential and privileged, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Mike, I'm afraid we're going to run out of time before you can tell me the key points. What conclusions did you come to? What do people need to know about U.S. intelligence, lessons from the past and for the future?
Okay. This board was set up to be advisory board, nonpartisan, objective advisory board to the President alone. And over the years, it was established in 1956 under Eisenhower. Up to the present day, we found that the board has been successful in advising the President of numerous issues involving American intelligence. We've seen some declassified recommendations, some declassified studies by this, but for the most part, we interviewed some 26 former senior people in governments, in our government, who they were able to give us an idea of the kinds of things that we have, that the PIFIAB did. They can't talk about all the results, but we got a good idea, and we concluded the PIFIAB was successful. The
PIFIAB being the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, but you did tell me that you concluded it was successful, but you did have a major lesson or two having to do with the importance of human intelligence and humans in the loop. Would you talk about that? We just have about a minute left.
Okay. The human intelligence factor has been highlighted throughout the entire PIFIAB history. They keep saying we need to better it. The current President Bush is trying to increase human intelligence by 50%. And in my own career, I've seen the dichotomy between technical intelligence and human intelligence. And the human intelligence often is more important than the technical intelligence, and I have this here to show you.
Okay.
This is a bamboo firing device on a Viet Cong road mine that was dug up when I was in Vietnam in 1972 and given to me as a gift. Our high-tech metal detectors aren't going to be very effective against bamboo. A defector A young man who was a former VC came to us and said, I know where we planted a road mine. We went and we found this thing. We dug it up and people's lives were saved.
The lesson being then that satellites and computers are important,
Absolutely.
but they'll just never substitute for that human touch, the human operator that we have, the human agent that we're able to turn.
We need both, and absolutely we do need more and better human intelligence too.
Mike, thanks for being with us. We've been talking with Michael Abshire, who is a fellow now at the Scowcroft Institute at the Bush School of Government and Public Policy at Texas A&M. Thanks for being with us, Mike. And we hope you enjoyed this session of Bring It Home, and we hope you'll stay with us because we're going to have more sessions like this on Bring It Home, bringing home Homeland Security and public safety issues to you. Well, we're back on Bring It Home. I'm Dave McIntyre from the Integrative Center for Homeland Security, and we're here with Alyssa Stevens, our Operations Officer. Alyssa, thanks for being with us.
Nice to be here.
Alyssa does lots of research for us every week and always brings us one thing she found especially interesting. So tell us just one thing you found interesting this week, Alyssa.
This week, most interesting, I found the annual threat assessment of the intelligence community, and this is put out by the Director of National Intelligence, written by Dennis Blair.
A new position established recently by Congress, Dennis Blair, the new head, the new DNI. So as he looked across the world and looked at the threats that the United States faced, what was new?
Well, new actually this year, a big threat is the global economic crisis. And time in this is the greatest factor. It's the greatest threat to us. The longer it takes for us to recover, the more likely we have a chance of greater problems.
Well, this is something that's new for the intelligence community to be talking about this. And I understand why declining housing prices are a threat to me, but why did he see this as a threat globally?
Well, our economy actually is a big player in the global economy. And so as ours had this downturn, a lot of other economies were affected, even booming ones such as China and India. And the longer it takes for our economy, for other economies to recover, the greater probability that there will be a lot more instability in the countries.
Instability within countries or between countries.
Correct.
So that was one thing that was new. Now he also covered a lot of threats that were we've seen before. So what were a couple of those that he talked about?
A couple of those were extremist terrorist groups, and the greatest capability to threaten us now are these smaller extremist Muslim groups that are taking root in Pakistan and Afghanistan in place of Al-Qaeda.
Now that was an interesting point. In place of Al-Qaeda, which he actually said was declining in power.
Yes, they are. They're actually declining in power quite a bit. I think in those areas there's a growing resentment towards their great violence.
So we've had some progress. We've been warring against Al-Qaeda. We've brought them down their numbers. We're controlling their finances. And they've been replaced to some extent by local extremist groups that really threaten the local government rather than an international threat.
Exactly.
There are a couple other things, of course, that we've seen before, talking about China and talking about Northeast Asia and so forth. But talk just a second about what you had to say about Mexico and the drug threat.
Well, Mexico and the drug threat is a huge problem because first of all, they're one of the greatest suppliers of drugs in our country. A lot of drugs that come through here pass through Mexico at some point, if not originating there. Also, their location, their proximity to us, is a huge threat as the violence they're afraid could possibly cross over border.
Violence and corruption both headed this direction. Well, if someone wanted to learn more about what Dennis Blair had to say, the Director of National Intelligence, where would they go to find that information?
Well, this report, along with others put out, are at dni.gov. They can also visit our website, homelandsecurity.tamu.edu.
homelandsecurity.tamu.edu. So there you'll learn more. You can also learn more by coming back to our YouTube channel, Bring It Home, where we'll take the lessons of Homeland Security and national security and bring them home to you. Thanks for being with us. We're back on Bring It Home, where we take issues of Homeland Security and national security and bring them home to you. Today, we've got Sam Brody with us. He is the acting director of the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center at Texas A&M. Thanks very much for being with us, Sam.
Thank you for having me.
Your center just celebrated its 20th anniversary, which is pretty remarkable. Tell us what the Hazard Reduction Recovery Center does.
We are primarily a research-based organization, and we research how to prepare, mitigate, and recover from hazards, how to do that better over time.
Well, hazard's actually probably kind of a small word for what you actually deal with, because you deal with hurricanes, don't you? Hurricane Andrew, as well as small things like, for example, spills and environmental issues. Whole range of issues.
Correct. We look at everything from tornadoes to landslides to catastrophic hurricane-based events.
So 20 years your organization has been doing that. How have things changed in 20 years?
20 years ago, we started out with one research professor in a closet-sized office. And we've now grown into a $4.5 million externally funded research organization. We have 2 labs that house over 25 students. We have 2 graduate certificates. And we're more focused now on not response to disasters, but how to prepare for, mitigate, and recover from the hazard events.
Who was paying any attention to this hazard reduction mitigation 20 years ago?
Not many people, but today we realize that hazards and disasters are not solely acts of God. They're not naturally occurring processes. They're human-induced events. And because of that, we can prepare for and recover more effectively than we have in the past.
So hurricane, it may not be that mankind's doing something to cause the hurricane, but the way man builds, where he builds, the way he changes the landscape, the way he uses the terrain, all of these are things that can contribute to the impact of the disaster.
Exactly.
And you could get ahead of them and mitigate them.
That's exactly right. And that's where our research areas are focused right now, is how the built environment impacts the severity of the disaster like a flood or a hurricane.
Now, you've done a lot of work historically, but we've seen that recently here in our area, just down in Galveston, Bolivar Point, and so forth, where what man built really impacted the way the storm progressed and the recovery later.
Correct. We're looking at the pattern of development regionally, the urban form and structure of our towns and cities, and where we're building in terms of being more vulnerable, such as in floodplains, directly along the coast, and how we're building structurally, how that all impacts the damage that we saw after Hurricane Ike.
So Sam, when you say mitigation, what exactly is that your research could lead to?
A lot of our research right now is showing that if we take note of where we're building, rather than sprawling out across the landscape, if we focus in areas that are the least vulnerable and we install mitigation policies such as education, relocation, protecting wetlands, we can have a significant reduction in the amount of damage we're seeing from these storm events.
Now that's true for major events, but it's also true for minor hazards. I mean, you're in a department that focuses not just on architecture, but also on urban planning. Talk to us a little bit about smaller disasters or hazardous materials and how that interacts with the urban environment.
One of the areas that I research is chronic flooding. And chronic flooding is a function of placing impervious surface or pavement in a broad area on the landscape, and that's characteristic of our built environment in Texas, particularly around Houston. So the more pavement that you're putting into the built environment, the less area there is to run off, and so you get these ponding and flooding events. Texas is the #1 floodable state in the country.
Is that right?
Yes.
Despite all of the other things that I see up in the Midwest and so forth. And this is because we have so many low-lying areas. Texas, of course, built on bayous and swamps. And right now, so much cement, there's no place for the water to go.
Exactly.
So what do we do about that?
Well, first of all, when we continue to grow, we try to focus our growth in the least vulnerable areas, which would not be in the floodplain. We try to protect the ecological integrity of our hydrological systems, such as wetlands, areas that collect, store, and slowly disseminate water. The impact on naturally occurring wetlands along the coast of Texas has been quite severe over the last 20 years, and that's one of the main reasons why we're getting a lot of these chronic floods.
Sam, who do you do your research for? You said you do a lot of externally focused research. Who pays for that?
Our center is funded by the National Science Foundation. We have grants from the National Park Service, from NOAA and FEMA, and the Homeland Security Department.
Impressive, because those are competitive grants.
Yes, most of our grants are extremely competitive, and we're very proud to have a portfolio of well over $4 million of external grants. And right now we're in an upswing, not only because we consider ourselves stellar researchers, but society's now focusing on these problems, fold climate change into that, and there's a lot of opportunities to do research because we're finally focusing on how we can avoid losses from these disaster events.
Now, Sam, you also have a lot of interest from students who see both something they can do to change the world and a personal future here. Talk to us about the education programs you offer at the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center, would you?
We have a graduate certificate, which is part of our Master's in Urban Planning, and a student can take a series of elective courses based on recovery, mitigation, and response. And at the end of their degree, they'll get a statement on their transcript which shows their certificate. The program is in an upswing, as you can imagine, because young people today realize that we can do better in terms of reducing losses and recovering better from events, avoiding a Katrina-type scenario. And so the students are very interested. They come and take courses, but they also engage in the research. As I said earlier, we've got over 25 supported graduate students who are out collecting data, doing surveys, analyzing data, and that's part of their education.
Real world experience in education.
We just had a project where we had 9 students from Texas A&M College Station, 8 from Texas A&M Galveston, and we went out into the field post-Ike and we did damage assessments on particular parcels on Galveston Island, and the students were the real drivers of that research.
Yeah, that's tremendous. This is a graduate program?
This is a graduate program.
And how many hours are that to go into that for a student?
It's about 10 to 12 hours of elective courses. So it's built on top of their core, and they can choose from various courses that we offer and other courses around campus that qualify for the program.
We only have about 2 minutes left, but for someone who wants more depth than that, can a student get more depth through your program?
Yes, we have doctoral students as well who dedicate their studies and their research in some aspect of hazard reduction. And so we have students who are here for 4 or 5 years. They're taking all the courses, plus they're starting their own research projects on their way to become, hopefully, an assistant professor somewhere at a Research One university.
Sam, your program has definitely changed in 20 years. Do you think it's having an impact? Are people listening?
I think they are. Our job, we are researchers, and so it's difficult to disseminate the information, but we're finally moving towards projects and developing systems where we can more effectively communicate with the practitioners and the decision makers. And there's more emphasis on hazard reduction, particularly under the rubric of sustainability and resiliency, so more people are seeking us out to find information.
I know you've reworked your website recently to put more information on that. How would somebody find out about you and your program online?
You can go to the main campus university website, which is www.texas.tamu.edu, or you can go directly to the Hazard Center website, which is hrrc.tamu.edu.
hrrc.tamu.edu.
That's correct.
Sam Brody, thank you for being with us. Sam is the Acting Director of the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center here at Texas A&M. Hope you've enjoyed that, learned more, and you will learn more than that if you'll stay with us and come back on Bring It Home.
Think forward. Think Research Channel.